Welcome to Train Signal. In this video, we're going to take a look at terms that are important in Active Directory both in Windows 2000 and in Server 2003. Now what the goal is here is to kind of clear up some of the mystery behind these terms. And some of them are theoretical in nature, but it is pretty important to have a solid grasp of how these work. Let's get started by taking a look at the different terms that we're going to take a look at today. First, we're going to start off looking at global catalog servers. And we talked a little bit about this in our previous video, talking about the new features in Server 2003. Well, in this video, we're going to spend more time with it just to make sure that you have a better comfort level with global catalog servers. We're also going to be working with Universal Group Membership and Universal Group Membership caching. Okay, both of these, just to understand this term and how this concept works. Universal Principal Names, the schema, FSMO roles, okay, flexible single master operation roles. You might have also heard of operation masters before. That's the same thing here. And then functional levels. We're going to take a closer look at these new functional levels in Server 2003, kind of explain how they work and what the differences are between the different functional levels that we have. Okay, so let's get started. We'll start off first taking a look at what a global catalog server is, and then how we can change things around and why it's important in Active Directory. Okay, global catalog servers. First, let's focus on what they are. Okay, and as we've got stated right here, global catalog servers are special domain controllers in 2000 and Server 2003 that store partial Active Directory object information from all the domains in a forest. Now let's hold on a second before I give you too much of a detailed explanation. Let's take a look at a couple more things here, and then we'll kind of put all these different terms together to try and give you a better feel for what we're talking about. Next, we've got global catalog servers save on bandwidth and result in domain logins and queries becoming more efficient. Okay, and then how are they installed? Global catalog is automatically installed on the first domain controller in the domain or forest, and additional global catalog servers are installed through Active Directory sites and services. Okay, let's focus on this for a second now. When we're dealing with Active Directory domain controllers, okay, domain controllers send information back and forth by replication. And typical domain controllers in an Active Directory environment replicate the users, okay, user objects, groups, that type of information. Well, there's also other information that's replicated back and forth between different domain controllers. Okay, now outside of a particular domain, however, so let's say that we have two different domains in our Active Directory infrastructure, that information, okay, users and computers, is not replicated back and forth between domain controllers in two different domains. Let's borrow one of our diagrams from a upcoming session here. Okay, here we have a diagram showing three domains. Let's just focus on that. We don't care about the site at this point right now. Okay, so you see here we have just a domain controller in each one of these different domains, and that's just a representative domain controller. Well, if I set up a user named Ben here in this domain controller, that user will not be replicated to these domain controllers. Okay, so if we had another domain controller here, and you know we definitely would, you almost never have just one domain controller in a domain. Well, object information such as users and groups and all that stuff within Active Directory is replicated back and forth between the domain controllers here. Well, same thing applies over here as well. Object information will be replicated back and forth here within this domain, and likewise with this one. So that brings up our next question then. If all the replication only takes place then within these three individual domains, how does a user sitting over here in the east domain gain access to some resource sitting over here in the west domain or up here in the main forest root domain? Okay, and that's where the global catalog information comes in. So let's go back over here to our diagram, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, so what these global catalog servers do, instead of replicating everything and replicating that full Active Directory database of users and computers across the entire forest infrastructure, they replicate a subset of information. Okay, and this is important because if we replicated the full Active Directory databases between these three different domains here, it could really eat up a lot of bandwidth, and that's the true reason that we use a global catalog server. Okay, let me explain that a little bit better. If I set up Active Directory here and I've got tons of objects, say we have 10,000 or even 1,000,000 different objects within the Active Directory domain, we don't really want to be replicating information here across our wide area network bandwidth over into a different site over here. Okay, and likewise, we don't want replication occurring this way either. Global catalog servers, when I have a global catalog server set up, they store a subset of information from all the different domains within our forest. Okay. Now, when we say a subset, what does that mean exactly? Well, a subset of information. Well, it's going to contain user account names from these particular domains. So if we've got users down here, Joe and Jill, and over here we have Bob and Barb, those user accounts will be stored in this global catalog server, okay, within the global catalog information. We also have some other commonly searched upon attributes that will also be included. Possibly things like username, group, universal group membership, okay, information that's commonly searched for. Okay, that's the type of information that by default is included within the global catalog information. And what this does, it allows the global catalog server to get a partial database of all the different objects within the entire forest without replicating the entire piece. Okay, so I have a little bit of information about, Barb and Bob, but I don't have their full user account, so that saves on a lot of bandwidth when we're replicating information back and forth. Now, so global catalog servers then, we're going to have these, at least one, in our forest infrastructure. Let's go back over here to our diagram again. We'll talk more about this. Okay, how are they installed? The first global catalog server is automatically installed on the very first domain controller in the domain. Additional global catalog servers can be installed through the Active Directory Sites and Services tool. We're going to take a look at that in a second, and we'll show you how that works. What are the main functions? Global catalog servers have really two main functions that you'll see within Microsoft documentation, and then a third here that we'll just talk of briefly. First function here, global catalog server provides universal group information. This is very, very important. Okay, anytime a user is logging on, we have to have this universal group information. Okay, and this allows a user to log on from any domain in the forest using what's called a universal principal name. And we'll talk about these upcoming here. It's one of our terms that we're going to talk about today, universal principal name. So going back to our diagram, as we were showing before, that will allow Barb, who's normally a member of this east domain, to visit somebody over here in the west and log on to a domain controller here. Okay, because if we didn't have that information, the west domain controllers would have no idea who Barb was. So now Barb can log on to the domain controllers here. What will happen is that information, her credentials, will be checked first here, then passed down to this domain controller. She'll be authenticated, and that information will then be passed back over to our west domain controllers. Okay, back here then. It also allows directory objects to be searched for within the entire forest, not just the domain. Okay, so once again, you can picture this right here. This Active Directory is also a fully searchable database. So if I wanted to look for a color printer located on the third floor of the building A, whatever your building might be called, well, I can do that, and by having the global catalog server, I'm not limited to only searching here in my domain. Now with the global catalog server, since it will contain partial information for all the objects within the Active Directory, I can search for that, and it's going to search all the different domains within my forest. Okay, let's go over some of these technical details, get a little bit better feel for how this global catalog server works, and then we'll go take a look at how we can set it up. Okay, first off, a global catalog server is required in almost all cases to log on to the network. Okay, so if we don't have a global catalog server available and a user attempts to log on, they're not going to be able to log on to the actual domain. Okay, well, what'll happen, just skipping here, is cache credentials will be used, and that user is going to log on to the local machine only, and they won't have access, like I said a second ago, to the domain resources. Also, what will happen, if you applied group policies and you wanted group policies to be applied to this user or the computer, those also will not take effect, so it's kind of a big deal. And then up here, global catalog server is not required for a domain admin to log on. Okay, so domain admin, that information, the full information is stored within the Active Directory domain controllers just to make sure that there's no issues and a domain admin can log on and troubleshoot any problems that might occur. Now, The Server 2003 Active Directory is actually partitioned off into now 4 distinct parts. Okay, in 2000 it was 3 distinct parts. Well, in Server 2003, what we're speaking of here is the Active Directory database itself. It's kind of divided up into smaller, more manageable chunks. We've got a schema partition, a configuration partition, a domain partition, and then our application directory partition, which is the new feature here in 2003. Now the schema partition, this just contains information regarding the schema, which is the objects and attributes that can be defined with an Active Directory. If you're not familiar with the schema, once again, this is one of the terms we will be defining in this video, so we'll take a closer look at what the schema actually is. The configuration partition, this defines what domains, what the naming structure is in the forest. Okay, so all the information here is going to just basically specify the different domains that we have. Then the domain partition, this is the main partition that we think of when we think of Active Directory. This is the one with our users and groups and printers, all the objects that are contained within the Active Directory. Okay, and then the application directory partition, this now contains application-specific information for directory-enabled applications such as Exchange Server and some other Microsoft software. Okay, so now the purpose of this, why we really care, is normal domain controllers will replicate some of this, and global catalog servers will replicate a little bit different information. So that's why we want to focus on this, and this is something, if you're a MCSE test taker, this will be covered on your Active Directory exams. So what we have here, domain controllers, so now we're just talking about a normal domain controller in any of our domains. They have the responsibility of replicating the schema partition, configuration partition, application directory partition, and then the domain partition, but only for their local domain. Okay, and this is kind of what we were talking about before. So let's repeat this a little bit. The schema partition, this schema is common to our entire forest. So if we look here, if you know anything at all about the schema, well, there's one schema per forest, and that's what we're going to have here. So a domain controller in each of these different domains here will replicate that schema information between all 3 of these different domain controllers, okay, assuming that we just have these 3. Okay, so the schema information is passed amongst all the different domain controllers. Then we go to our configuration partition, and that's remember, the part that defines the names of the domains, okay, the different configuration of the actual forest structure. And that, again, is passed between all the different domain controllers. Okay, then we have domain partition, and this is common to the particular domain that we're in. Okay, so it says the local domain here. So domain controllers in different domains do not pass this partition back and forth to each other. So it's unique, it's different from those first 2 that we discussed. So if I had a second domain controller drawn out here in the west domain, well, these 2 domain controllers will pass information back and forth because they exist in the same domain. So I create a username Joe and one domain controller, and that will be replicated to the other domain controller here. However, if I create this user Joe, it's not going to be replicated up here. We don't pass that domain partition information, and that's exactly what user accounts or group accounts or computer accounts are. Oops, let's get back over here to our diagram once again. Okay, and then the like we mentioned, application directory partition, that also is going to be replicated only on some 2003 domain controllers, and we put only on some because you have the choice. Okay, you can choose, pick and choose which domain controllers will replicate that Active Directory information. Don't worry about this 4th one right now. This is something that our focal point really isn't on this application directory partition, but rather this next point here, and that's what are global catalog servers and what's the difference between what they replicate compared to what the domain controllers replicate. Okay, well, this is fairly easy because for the most part it's exactly the same. You see we have the schema partition, the configuration partition, the domain partition for the local domain. If you read up here, that matches exactly. Okay, but right here, this is the big difference. Global catalog servers also replicate a subset of the properties, okay, a partial replica, for all directory objects in the forest. Okay, and this is replicated between global catalog servers only. Okay, so a subset of the properties of all directory objects. That's what we were talking about before. Okay, I've got an object like the Joe user account. Well, a subset of that would be Joe. Okay, maybe his first name, his last name, okay, his email address. There are default attributes that are part of this partial replica, and you can also set these as well. You can modify these within the schema. So you have some control over this subset of properties that we're kind of talking about up here, but this is not something you need to mess with. Okay, so if we go back over to our drawing then, let's take a look at how this might work. Now, right now we have 3 domains like we said before, and there's just one global catalog server. So in this case here, we don't really have anything to look at because there's no other global catalog server for this GC to replicate with. However, if we added a global catalog server to either one of these domains or both of them, okay, so just picture that we add either change this one here, we add another domain controller here, modify this drawing up. Okay, so this is my other global catalog server here. What will happen now is, in addition to these guys replicating back and forth to each other, well, the global catalog servers will also replicate information. Okay, so these 2 global catalog servers will replicate information, and this is what we were just talking about a second ago. Okay, instead of this global catalog server replicating the full Active Directory database like these 2 domain controllers do, the global catalog server and the global catalog server that we added will only replicate a partial subset of the information from this domain and this domain. Okay, from the Ben and Brady domain and the West domain. So that Joe user account, down here, we're going to replicate partial information up here. And the Sue user account up here, only partial information will be included within that global catalog replication. Okay, just enough so when we want to perform searches or logons across the forest, we won't have any problems with it, just to give you a feel for how that works. Okay, last thing we should talk about is one recommendation that we don't see up here. Okay, and that is we need to put global catalog servers by default 1 per site. Okay, we didn't specifically go over this before, but this is the default Microsoft recommendation. And if we go back over and take a look at this diagram, okay, here where we have the single domain with 2 sites, it doesn't matter how we break it down, and you don't necessarily have to follow this per se, but this is the default Microsoft recommendation. If you have multiple sites like we have here, we've got a San Francisco and a North Carolina site, ideally you should have a global catalog server in each different site. And the purpose being here is, for your users logging on, it'd be nice if they had a global catalog server here locally so they can get this information instead of having to cross across this wide area network here and pull information from a global catalog server. Okay, so just to give you a feel for that. And this is definitely how it was recommended in Windows 2000. In Server 2003 now, we started talking about this before, but we have a new feature that we can use that can eliminate this. Okay, and this is called Universal Group Membership. Universal Group Membership Caching, actually. So let's go ahead and add that term here so there's no confusion. Universal Group Membership Caching. Now, what this is, like I said, we started talking about this before, but let's do a brief review, and then we'll take a look at how this can be enabled, and then we'll go back over to our Active Directory sites and services and take a look at both global catalog servers and this Universal Group Membership Caching at the same time. Okay, so first off, it's a new feature in Server 2003. It allows us to reduce the number of necessary global catalog servers. Okay, and basically this explains how it works here. A domain controller in a branch office site will contact a global catalog server and cache the user's universal group information. Okay, subsequent logons after the first will be handled locally instead of passing over a wide area network link. Let's take a look at what we mean by this. Okay, here's the old way of doing things. Okay, and this works perfectly fine. We have global catalog servers in then both of our locations here. Well, this might not be acceptable because these global catalog servers, as we were talking about, still have to replicate information. And we only have 128K here. Maybe this is jammed packed with data already. So it's really, really slow, and it brings the wide area network overall bandwidth down even further. So what we could do here, instead of making this a global catalog server, get rid of this, okay, and then put that new feature that we were just talking about, the caching here, on this site. And now what's going to happen, as we just talked about, the universal group name caching, what'll happen, the first time somebody logs on, they'll be passed over to this global catalog server. The request will be made. That information will be brought back across over here to this site, and that information then is going to be cached here locally within the domain controllers. So the next time somebody over here, some user account, attempts to log on to either one of these domain controllers, well, that universal group information that they need is now cached here locally on our domain controllers. Okay, so it's an alternative to using global catalog servers within our Active Directory structure. Okay, going back over here then again to our chart, a couple things to note before we go over and take a look at how this is configured once again. First, universal group membership caching is not turned on by default, so this is something if you want to use, you will have to turn on. And then secondly, it's enabled at the site level. Okay, and then once this is enabled, universal group membership caching will apply to all the domain controllers in the site. Okay, so I think we kind of mentioned that a second ago, but once we enable it at the site level, all the domain controllers here will participate in that universal group membership caching. All right, what we're going to do now is connect over then to our domain controller and take a look at how we can configure both of these. Changed our username there, so we have an error. So change my username here just for security reasons in that previous video. And we're logging back over to this machine here, and we're going to go into Active Directory sites and services here once this comes up. Starts, Programs, Administrative Tools, and then Active Directory sites and services. Okay, we showed you before in the earlier video basically that we had two different sites created here, a North Carolina and a San Francisco site. And this is really meant to mirror that drawing that we looked at a couple diagrams back. Let's take a quick look here. Pretty much this right here is exactly what we have. Okay, so we set this up. So we're back over to the server here. We have a North Carolina site. And within the North Carolina site, we have server 2. Within the San Francisco site, we have server 1. Both of these are domain controllers. Now, the first thing we can do, if we want to change this up and we want to configure global catalog servers in both of our different sites, first, by default, this server, server 1, was the very first domain controller in the entire forest. Okay, so this is the very first domain controller. So by default, if I go to properties here, oops, wrong thing here. We need to go to NTDS settings, then go to properties. And if we look here, we see that global catalog is selected. Okay, let's take a look back here. I want to make sure you see where we went. Okay, San Francisco, server 1, NT directory services settings, okay, and global catalog is checked. Now, if we go over to our North Carolina server, this is our domain controller that exists within North Carolina. By default, this one would not be checked. Okay, so shouldn't be checked here unless we made a change that we weren't aware of. And you can see here that it's not. It's as simple as checking this checkbox if you want it to be a global catalog server. Okay, by doing this and then clicking OK, it's now going to participate in that replication that we were talking about before. Okay, so it's really simple to set this up. Now, we showed this previously, but maybe instead of doing that, we opt for the second way of doing things where we don't really want to have a global catalog server in North Carolina, but instead we choose to take care of the new feature in Server 2003, Universal Group Membership Caching. Okay, that's a little bit different, still fairly easy to set up, but to do this, all that we need to do here is select North Carolina. Okay, and now instead of going to the individual server settings, we're going to North Carolina, and then we see that we have NT Directory Services site settings. Okay, and this is probably still enabled from when we did this before, and it is, but this normally is not checked. Okay, so this would not be checked, but by selecting this, Enable Universal Group Membership Caching, what we've done now is we've set this up so instead of having a global catalog server, we're going to take advantage of this new Universal Group Membership Caching feature. Okay, and once again, it's real simple. I just click OK, and it's set up and it's working here on the entire North Carolina site. Okay, right now there's only one domain controller, but if we had, 2, 3, however many, those domain controllers would all be participating in this universal group membership caching, preventing the users from having to go across our wide area network link whenever they log on. Okay, so fairly straightforward doing the configuration part. The theory, probably a little bit more difficult to get your hands around than the actual configuration. Okay, let's go back over to our important terms here and see where we are right now. Okay, and the next one here is universal principal names. New feature in Windows 2000. Okay, nothing's really changed with it in Server 2003, but this is something that I find students aren't really that familiar with or comfortable with, but I think that it's helpful to understand this. So I'm going to log off this domain controller here first because we're going to need to log back on in a second. Okay, so we've logged off this machine. Now we're back over to our XP machine where we're actually doing the video recording from. So universal principal names. Let's go ahead and open up our next section here and take a look at exactly what universal principal names are for. Basically, they don't have a lot of purpose besides used to simplify the logon process. Okay, that's one way we can use these. Another thing, besides simplifying it, it also can allow you to set up usernames for people that mirror what their email address might be. Okay, and that's what we're trying to get across here. With a normal logon, okay, so when you're normally logging onto a server, what do you have to provide? You provide a username, a password, and you also have to specify the domain name or the local computer that you'd be logging onto. So, for example, you type in Sue H, if that was your username, of course, and then you put in your password, and then where you're logging on. And I just threw in train signal here, so we're using Ben and Brady. Okay, so let me just demonstrate this just to make sure that you're with me. Here I'm forming a remote desktop connection over to the 192.168.1.100 machine. Okay, and what normally happens, this is what I'm talking about here. If you want to log on to a machine, what do you have to provide? Well, the username, the password, and then where you want to log on to. And in this case, we're specifying the actual domain name. Since this is a domain controller, I don't have another option. I can't log on to this account locally. It's kind of a lesson for another day, but if this was a local XP machine or a Windows 2000 standalone or member server, you would have another option here. Okay, so we're going to cancel this just for the time being. Going back over here to our universal principal names again, what we have in 2000 and 2003 is an alternative. Now what we can do is just supply a username and a password. Okay, so now by using universal principal names, you can use usernames that look very similar to what an email address would look like. And this is indeed what a lot of companies will do. They'll set it up so the usernames match the user's email address. Okay, so this is what I'd actually be logging on with. SueH@trainsignal.com. Password, of course, you'd have to specify a password still, but that log on to box would be grayed out automatically. As soon as you put the @ sign in, it becomes grayed out. Okay, so just another way of logging on. UPN name is the domain name by default. So our default domain name is, in the case we're going to be looking at in a second, benandbrady.com. We'll take a look at that. Additional UPN names can be specified in Active Directory, which can be used anywhere, used by anyone or anywhere in the forest. So we'll look at that as well. And then also UPN names can be added through the Active Directory domains and trusts. Let's go take a look, see what we're talking about here. If I click remote desktop connection, we're going to connect just back over to that server again. And the first thing we'll demonstrate is, hey, how does this work? Okay, well, remember, I've got my username set up, Scott S. Okay, and now instead of using this, what I'm going to do is just specify my UPN name. And notice as soon as I put that @ sign in here, this is now grayed out. I no longer have a choice of what to do with this. Okay, and now I just specify benandbrady.com. Do you have to put my password in? Okay, and just like that, I'm logged onto the system. And this does nothing for me in addition to a normal logon. It's either or. I'm getting the same thing, the same desktop, profile's the same, no extra access, nothing like that. Okay, it's just a different way of logging on. Let's go take a look at this user account to explore how this is different, though, mechanically within Active Directory. So if I open this up and go into Active Directory users and computers, what we're going to do is examine the actual user account that we just logged on with, and that's this Scott S account. So I double click it to pull up my properties, and what I'll do is go over here to account. Okay, and here we can see two different areas where we can specify a logon name. Okay, here's our pre-Windows 2000 name that you probably use all the time. I do as well. It's more, common, and that's just plain old name. Scott S is the username. Here's the domain name that you must specify when you log on. And in this case, we don't really have a choice. That's the one that comes up. Here's the user principal name, scotts@benandbrady.com. Okay, this is the name that we've selected as a logon name. And if I click this drop-down box here, there's nothing else in here right now, so I can't really do anything else with this. Okay, so nothing too exciting here. I will tell you, however, if you change this, let's just say I change this to Sam, okay, and I leave this one as Scott S, boy, that's going to be confusing because anytime you log on the old style way, you have to put in Scott S. Anytime you log on the new style way using your UPN, it's going to be sam@benandbrady.com. So I highly recommend that these names match each other. Okay, it's not something you really want to change up. So I'm going to put that back in here again, and just to make sure, we'll cancel this. Okay, next thing we'll do, let's go take a look at how we can add an alternative or an additional UPN name. To do this, we have to go into the Active Directory Domains and Trust tool. Okay, and then once we're here, we're going to go into the properties of this piece. Oops, wrong one. Click on this top piece here, properties. Okay, and we see UPN suffixes. Okay, alternative UPN suffixes. So what I can do here, let's say that I do want to use trainsignal.com. Okay, and why would I do this? Well, maybe we have a domain name. For example, we're using benandbrady.com as our domain name, but actually our email address, our domain name we use for our email, maybe it's BNB. BNB.com, something like this. Okay, so what I'd like to do is have users be able to log on with this. Okay, or another reason, sometimes in some companies, they have a very complex domain structure where the actual domain name that people would normally be using to log on is something like la.west.northamerica.widgets.com. Well, that's a lot to type out. So what we can do instead of somebody using this as their normal domain name, take that away and just have them use something a little bit simpler. So, and this is where one of these could come in. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just leave these in here right now. I'm going to click OK. Okay, and we can close this. And I don't know if it'll come up already. Let's check this out and see if it already comes up. There we go. Okay, so by doing this, we're back into Active Directory users and computers. I go to the logon name here, and look what I can do now. I can actually change this name up. I can use any of the UPN suffixes that I want to use here. So I can keep the original, or if I want a shortened name, I can use bnb.com, or if I want to use trainsignal.com, hey, no problem whatsoever. Okay, and don't be overly confused by this. This has nothing to do with live domain names or messing things up with email. This is just strictly a way to log on to this system. Okay, so if I do leave this right here, just like we have, I can click OK. Okay, and then we're going to log off this system and just demonstrate real quickly how this works. So I'm going to log right back on again here. Okay, and first we're going to try the name we just used a second ago, scott@benandbrady.com with our password. Okay, and it doesn't work. Okay, that no longer works. So let's see if our new domain name, and that doesn't work either because I left out the Scott S. Okay, scotts@trainsignal.com. Got a really complex password. Okay, and that logs us on here without any issues. Okay, so another way you can go about, just another alternative, another change you can make to this. So fairly straightforward, but a lot of users, students, really aren't familiar with that feature. Okay, let's go take a look then here again at our next feature. Okay, next up, what we're going to talk about is the Active Directory schema. So let's go take a look at our specific sheet on the Active Directory schema. Now, the schema within Active Directory defines the type of objects that can be created within our Active Directory. Okay, so objects, when we speak of objects, we're dealing with users and groups and computers and shared folders. There's all sorts of different objects, and we commonly work with, maybe 5 or 6 different types of objects. The schema also defines what kind of attributes we can create for each of those different objects. Okay, we've kind of defined this a little bit better here. Attributes, that's the information that can be defined about any particular object. So for example, a user object contains a first name and a last name and phone number, groups, anything that you can type in and define, that is the type of attribute that can be defined for that particular object. Okay, so we'll point those out to you just to make sure that it's painfully obvious. But just open up Active Directory users and computers, go to create a new user, and anything you see in there that you can define, that's considered an attribute. Now the information that you specifically type in, that's the attribute value. Okay, so the fact that you can define the first name, the last name, the middle name, those are the attributes. If you type in Mary, Sue, those names and first, middle, last name, those are the actual attribute values. Now, one other thing here, the schema is extensible, okay, meaning that it can be changed or modified. You can define additional objects or attributes, okay, and typically schema changes aren't done by you, but they take place when you install directory-enabled applications such as Microsoft's Exchange Server. Okay, now when I say they typically don't take place by you, it's fairly uncommon to change the schema, and it's also very consequential. You got to be very careful when you make changes to the schema, because making a mistake in the schema can be detrimental to your whole Active Directory forest to the point where it may not be functional. Okay, and that's definitely not a mistake you want to make, in a production environment. So stay away from the schema unless you know exactly what you're doing. If you even know what you're doing, take your time. Plan it out, test it out on a test network first before you do anything within the live Active Directory schema. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're going to connect over to our domain controller here that we've been working on. Okay, and the first thing we'll do, just to make sure that you're comfortable with what we're talking about, we'll open up Active Directory users and computers and point out to you that show you what we're talking about when we say objects and also attributes. Now, objects and attributes, by the way, there are close to 200 different objects that can be created within the Active Directory, and we don't, use anywhere near that many. Attributes, there's close to 1,000 different attributes that can be defined, and some attributes can be defined. If you look at computer accounts, here's a computer account. If we open this up, well, the attributes that can be defined, well, DNS name, role, description, okay, name, version, service pack, member of, all these are considered attributes. The information populated within here, those are the attribute values. Now, if we look at a user account, we'll just pick on this one here again. Once again, we see here are attributes. Okay, all these would be attributes. Attribute values are what we type in here, the value we fill in for that particular piece. Okay, so just to give you a good feel for this. Now, from time to time, under special circumstances, you may want to define additional objects or attributes, actually. So an additional object would be the ability to create something like, well, we have user accounts. Maybe we also want to be able to create books is the first thing that comes to mind. Or within your Active Directory, you want to add computer parts. Maybe you want to inventory motherboards and memory chips and hard drives within your Active Directory. Well, right now, if we right-click here and go down to New, we don't have the ability to add a computer part. Well, if you chose to, you could add that particular piece to the schema, and you would have the ability to add a computer part. Okay, more I think common would be to add attributes. For example, if you look at a user account here, nowhere within the user account do you see a field for social security number. Well, that may be something that you want to include. You may want to put maybe sales team or SOC number, anything you want to put. You may want to populate some other information for this particular Active Directory object. So if that's something that you want to use company-wide, you might extend your schema, okay, change it to add that particular attribute, the attribute to define a social security number. Okay, let's take a look at how we can actually do this if we wanted to. And we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of changing the schema, because that's something, like we said, is very complex, really for schema admins and for programmers, and that's not what this video is all about. We will show you where it exists and how to get there. Now, the schema can be managed by the schema snap-in. Okay, and what we'll look at first, if we type in MMC, this is how we normally add in snap-ins. However, if we go to add remove snap-in without doing anything first and go down and look for our schema snap-in, it's not there. Okay, alphabetically it should be right in between here, and nothing is here. And I think it actually might be under Active Directory schema, one or the other, but either way, it's not located here. Okay, so the reason they don't make it very easy to just open up and start messing around with it, you have to run a tool and actually install the ability to use the schema first. Okay, and that can be done by running this command here from our command line. Okay, we can, let's go to our command prompt first. Okay, so CMD, and then the command is regsvr32. Okay, then you put in a space, and then you're going to add the actual DLL, Dynamic Link Library file. Okay, and this is the schema management DLL, which will allow us to actually manage the schema. And this command here is registering this particular service. Basically what that means is make it available to us. So when I hit enter here, we see that this tells us that this was indeed successful. So all that I really need to do here is click OK. We can close our command prompt now. And now when I come up here to add remove snap-in, okay, now I see that I do have Active Directory schema. That wasn't there before. So I click Add, Close, and if I click OK, now I've opened up the Active Directory schema, and if I chose to modify this, now I can start taking a look at the different pieces that can be modified of the schema. Okay, and here we see classes. These would be object classes, and then attributes, okay, the particular attributes that can be changed. And just looking down this even briefly, you start looking at some of these, and pretty intimidating when you start reading this stuff. Doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. We do see here we have the user object though. Okay, and within the user object, look at all this stuff here. This probably makes a little bit of sense. Pager and mobile, manager, mail. All of these are the attributes that you can specifically define about this user. Okay, so this is where it's all, basically done here. So just to give you a feel for some of the other things we can do, if we go to the properties of the user, okay, here we see an attribute list. These are all optional attributes. We don't see any mandatory up here. If we wanted to, we could click add. So there's a lot we can do to this once you know and once you're experienced with the schema. Okay, so we're not going to go beyond what we see right now. We just want to really get familiar with it, get a feel for what actually happens here. And this is how you install it and get to it. Okay, so we're going to close this out here. And we're going to go back over to our base system and take a look at what our next definition is going to be. Okay, so let's go over here. Next up, we have our FSMO roles, Flexible Single Master Operator roles, oftentimes called Operation Masters. Now, FSMO roles played an important part in Windows 2000, and they continue to play an important part in Server 2003. Let's take a closer look at exactly what we mean by Flexible Single Master Operations roles. Okay, once again, normally abbreviated either FSMO, or here we have our first bullet point, also referred to as Operations Masters. Okay, now, keep in mind, when we're dealing with Active Directory replication, for the most part, we're using multi-master replication. And if you're not familiar with what that term means, well, if we have two different domain controllers, those domain controllers in a domain are going to replicate back and forth with each other. Okay, a single master replication would mean that one of those domain controllers is the master, and all changes have to be made on that particular copy, and then the changes would be replicated out to all the other domain controllers. When we have a multi-master replication situation, as we do in 2000 and Server 2003, That means you can go to any domain controller, make a change on that domain controller, and that change then will be propagated to all the other domain controllers. Okay, multi-master. Now, multi-master, though, does not work for all the different situations, for all the different things that need to be done within 2000 and 2003. And that's where these single master operation roles came from. Okay, there are some things that are better off if there are not multiple places where changes can be made, but rather just one specific server where we're going to make these changes. And that's what we're going to take a look at next. We have 5 different FSML roles, and they're broken down into 2 categories. We have our forest-wide FSML roles, and you see right here, and this is real key to know, 1 per forest. So that means no matter how many domains we have, all the domains in one forest are going to have just one schema master and one domain naming master. Now you can set this up on any server that you want to set it up on, okay? But it has to be just on one. You don't have a choice. There's no way to set it up on multiple domain controllers. Okay, so let's talk about what these are. A schema master. Okay, this is exactly what it sounds like, but this is the only server that's available to perform read-write copies of the schema. So if you're going to make changes to the schema master has got to be present. Okay, when we say present, well, maybe you took the server down for servicing or the domain controller failed. You had a motherboard or a hard drive problem or something. If the schema master were not available, you wouldn't be able to make a change to the schema. Okay, or if you installed a directory-enabled application like Exchange Server, okay, it makes modifications directly to the schema, so that installation would fail. You wouldn't be able to go through and complete that Exchange Server installation. Okay, so just one server, one domain controller in the entire forest will be a schema master. We'll take a closer look at all of these in a second. Now next we have the domain naming master, and this is responsible for ensuring unique domain names throughout the forest. So basically, when you're setting up a brand new domain, you're going to go talk to the domain naming master and make sure the domain name you're picking has not already been used. Okay, and you can see it's probably obvious as to why you wouldn't want that if we had multiple domain names. Okay, 2 separate domains in 2 different cities, but we happen to use the same name. That causes a lot of confusion, and Active Directory to be thoroughly confused as well. Domain-wide FSML roles, okay, and these are 1 per domain. So if we just have one domain, we're only going to have, one of these in the domain. If we have multiple domains, every domain we have is going to have one of these roles on a domain controller. And these roles can be all on one domain controller, as we'll see in a second, or they can be spread out amongst many different domain controllers. Okay, so let's go through these one by one before we take a closer look. The PDC emulator, primary domain control emulator, goes back to our NT 4.0 domain days, and this is especially important if you're still syncing up with NT 4.0 domain controllers, because this one machine is going to be responsible for the replication between NT4 domain controllers and 2000 or Server 2003 domain controllers. Another responsibility of this machine, it also syncs time within the domain. The RID master ensures that each object, okay, your users and computers, receive a unique ID number. Every time you create a brand new user or group, it's assigned a serial number, okay, a unique ID number, and that's how it's actually identified throughout the Active Directory. We see the name on the surface, so you add permissions, let's say, for Joe, but underneath there, Joe has a unique identifier. That's what we're dealing with here. This RID master is in control of all these different IDs and make sure that it generates unique ID numbers. The infrastructure master is responsible for maintaining universal group membership, and it does this for all the different domains in the forest. Okay, so we need one machine that's dedicated in each domain, let's say. One machine is dedicated to maintaining this universal group membership so there's no discrepancies. Okay, let's take a look at a diagram we've put together just to make sure you get a better feel for what we mean by forest-wide and what we mean by domain-wide FSML roles. Okay, here we have a forest structure with 3 domains, and what we've done here is defined, assuming that we have all of our roles on one domain controller, what would be required in each of our different domains. Okay, so here you see we have one domain controller, and this has forest roles of schema master and the domain naming master, and in addition it's carrying the domain roles PDC emulator, RID master, and infrastructure master, all 5 of the different roles that we just discussed. Down here, when we take a look at our 2 other domains, notice that they do not have schema master or domain naming master. Okay, why is that? Well, that's just what we discussed a second ago. We only need these particular roles carried out on one machine. That's the requirement within Windows 2000 or Server 2003 Active Directory. So just one machine in the entire forest, okay, is going to be a schema master and a domain naming master. These other roles, as you see here, they're one per domain. Okay, and that's why we have the PDC emulator, RID master, and infrastructure master. We have those roles defined in each of our 3 different domains here. Now, when we're defining these, when we actually want to go through and change these or set these up or see which machine actually is carrying these roles, we do that in various places. We're going to go take a look at that in a second. Keep in mind that you can change these around. If for some reason you want to change, let's say you've got another domain controller here in this top domain, okay, and you feel like this domain controller would be a better fit to carry some of these roles, you can transfer roles over here. Okay, and we're going to see how you can do that in a second. And why would you want to do this? Well, a couple reasons. You know this machine might be failing. Okay, maybe it's an older machine and you're going to replace it. So you're going to transfer these roles over to another domain controller before you replace it. That'd be one reason. This machine just might have more, might be taxed, might be busier. Okay, so you might offset some of these resources, some of its responsibilities to this machine here. Okay, just some reasons why you might perform this action. Let's go take a look at how we can do that. And the first thing we're going to look at is how we change our forest roles. So we'll look at the schema master and then the domain naming master. Okay, because these are done in actually different places than our other 3 here. Okay, to do this, we're going to form a remote desktop connection over to the same domain controller we've been working with at 192.168.1.100. I should probably fix that one of these times so we get an automatic log on here. Okay, and the first thing we're going to look at, we're going to show you how we can change the schema master. And this is done by going into that snap-in that we had opened before in the previous section on schemas. So we go to, we didn't save our MMC, so we're going to have to rebuild this. But we shouldn't have to run that command that we ran before because we should still have the schema master or the ability to add the schema right here, and we do. Okay, so remember just a second ago we were taking a look at this and looking at some of the different object classes and attribute classes that we could define here. Well, what we're looking at right now is just how do we actually switch the role of this machine. And if we right click here and go to Operations Master, okay, we see right here it tells us what machine is currently acting as the schema master, server 1. If I want to change this, it tells us right here, click Change. Okay, and it tells us the current domain controller is the operation masters. To transfer this operations masters to a different domain controller, you need to target Active Directory schema to that domain controller. Okay, so if I click OK here and close this, what they're talking about, just need to right click here, okay, and then come up to change domain controller. And it's going to target which domain controller we're actually looking at. Okay, any domain name or any domain controller or specify a name. The other domain controller we have right now set up is called Server 2. So if we click OK here, let's see if we can actually get transferred over to Server 2. Okay, it did just do that. So right now we're looking at the schema according to what Server 2 thinks. So I'm going to come up here and now we're going to do the exact same thing. Operation Masters. Okay, and it says right here, here's the current schema master. To transfer the schema master role to the targeted domain controller below, click Change. Okay, because we're targeted now, because we went over and switched and connected to Server 2, it automatically fills this in for us. And if we want to switch this, all that we have to do is just click Change. Okay, are you sure you want to do this? I'm just going to say yes. Okay, and it's taken care of. Now, I just did this, relatively without, thinking too much about it, pretty carelessly, let's say. In a production environment, this is not something you just want to take lightly. You got to plan this out. You got to make sure you know what you're doing. Test this on a practice network first. Okay, this isn't something that, it's very simple to do, and there's really no issues in doing it, but just make sure that you know what you're doing and it's not going to affect your particular environment. Okay, always recommend that before you just go ahead and make changes such as I just did here. Okay, next we're going to go to Active Directory Domains and Trusts. Okay, we were in this tool before when we took a look at the UPN suffixes, And now what we're going to do, looks like Active Directory users and computers. It's not, though. There's nothing underneath here. If I right click, I can go to Properties. Okay, and we see Trusts, Managed By. Okay, so just some different things that we can do within here. We do see the domain functional level is at Windows Server 2003. However, the Forest functional level is still at Windows 2000. We're going to take a look at that in a second in our next section when we go over Forest functional levels. If I click up here, however, I get this exact same thing here where it says Operation Masters. And now what it's telling me here is the domain naming operation master ensures the domain names are unique. Okay, only one domain controller in the enterprise performs this role. And it would have been better, I suppose, if they put Forest here because that's more appropriate. Well, here's the current domain naming operation master, the server 1 that we were dealing with before. If we want to transfer this, we can't just change this right now. What we're going to have to do is do the exact same thing we saw before. And that is to first connect to a different domain controller. Okay, and here's the one we want to actually connect to. So I'm going to click OK down here at the bottom. Okay, and now if I come back in here again, we'll see that this is the server that's kind of been highlighted, the one we're connected to. And if I click Change, once again, it's asking me if I'm sure about this. Tells me that the operations master was successfully transferred. So no issues there transferring that role over. Okay, so it's really straightforward as far as doing this. It's pretty simple to do. Our last 3 roles are all done within Active Directory users and computers. And remember, these were the domain roles. Okay, so it kind of makes sense. The domain roles we can take care of just by going into our domain management tool that creates users and computers. And by coming in here, we do have this operation masters here. The same thing is going to apply though when we open this up. We're going to have to change the focus first. Before we do that, however, take a look. We do have RID, PDC, and then infrastructure. This is in reference to the 3 different operation masters that we talked of before. We have the RID master, the PDC emulator, and then the infrastructure master. So we can change all of these, none of these, or any mixture thereof. Okay, and it works exactly the same way. So we'll just change one of these. We'll change the RID master to show you how this works just within this environment. But what we're going to do is first connect over to a different domain controller, set the focus on this particular domain controller. So I click OK here to do so. And then now when I come back in here again and set up Operation Masters, exactly as before. All that I have to do is just click Change, ask me if I'm sure, I say yes, and no problems whatsoever. That particular RID master role has been transferred to Server 2. Okay, and you see it up here, Server 2. If I want to change it back again, well, I could just do the exact same thing. I'd have to first connect over, put the focus over here to, domain controller 1. Okay, but I can change this just as easily as I did before. Okay, it was transferred right back over again. All right, so this is really straightforward. The only time you run into problems, okay, and this is, if you think about it, might be the time where you most want to do it, is when you have one of your servers fail and you have to transfer that role over. So for example, what would happen if the schema master failed, the server failed, and you couldn't get that machine back up and running? You need to have that schema master up and running on your network in order to make changes to the schema. Now, changes to the schema don't happen every day, so you could go, possibly months before you even knew that it was down, or you might take that domain controller out of commission and forget all about the fact that it was the schema master, but at some point, you would have to access that schema master. And if the domain is no longer there, if the domain controller is no longer there, well, it's just not possible to do this here where we go connect to domain controller. Well, it's not going to show up. In that case, what you have to do is basically what's called seizing the role. Okay, seize the role. And that's done with the low-level utility, the NT Directory Services utility, NTDS UTIL. You have to use that tool. You reboot and you go into a special mode within Active Directory to actually use that tool. So outside of the scope of what we're doing right now, but a little bit more difficult, and I highly recommend access documentation from Microsoft's website because it's a somewhat complex process, and that tool is all command line based and kind of confusing until you've used it a couple times. Okay, that wraps up then our discussion on FSMO roles. and leaves us with one more important term left to talk about, and that is functional levels. Now, we started talking about functional levels before, and we went into it a decent amount, but we'll go over it just again here in this video to make sure that you've got a good comfort level of what we're dealing with when we say functional levels. Okay, functional levels in Windows 2000, these were referred to as mixed or native mode. Okay, so we called these modes in Windows 2000. And recall, or if you're not really sure what they're for, in Windows 2000 mixed mode, what it basically offered you was backwards compatible support for NT 4.0 domain controllers. Now, that was good if you still had NT 4.0 domain controllers, but if you wanted to take advantage of some of the new features in Windows 2000, you had to upgrade to native mode. Okay, but once you did that, all support for NT 4.0 domain controllers ceased. Now, make sure that you understand this because some people miss this point. It's only domain controllers. So if I had all Windows 2000 domain controllers, but I still had some NT4 servers, Windows 98 or even 95 clients on my network, they could still function and would have no problem with us upgrading to native mode. It was only Windows 2000 domain controllers. Well, in Server 2003, we essentially have the same thing, except now we have these and they're called functional levels. And we have two different types of functional levels in Server 2003, and those are domain functional levels and then forest functional levels. Now, the difference between domain and forest functional levels, well, if we're going to upgrade to domain functional level, the only requirement there is that our Windows 2000 machines are all upgraded to Server 2003, and this is just within the domain. Okay, and we're going to take a look at this here just to give you a feel for what we're talking about. Let's start off with our domain functional section here and look at the different levels that we can set in Server 2003. Now, the first one we have is Windows 2000 Mixed Mode. This is the default level, offers very limited features of Active Directory, supports NT4 2000 and Server 2003 domain controllers. So if you're going to be running in this mode, and this is something that maybe you have to have NT 4.0 domain controllers for some reason, there's an application or you don't have the money to upgrade, well, this is the functional level you're going to be in. And the downside is you're just not going to be able to take advantage of some of the newer features in both 2000 and Server 2003. Next step up, we have Windows 2000 native mode, and this is cutting off support for NT 4.0. It only supports 2000 and Server 2003 domain controllers. So pretty straightforward, I think. New Active Directory features starting in 2000 and up are supported, but Server 2003 features are not supported. Okay, and notice right here, this is the default level if you happen to upgrade your Windows 2000 domain controller to Server 2003. Your machine is not going to start off in Windows 2000 mixed mode because you upgraded a 2000 domain controller to Server 2003. Windows 2000 Server interim mode. Okay, 2003 interim mode. Special domain functional level that's used to upgrade NT 4.0 domain controllers directly to Server 2003. And notice here that 2000 domain controllers are not supported. Okay, so it's very similar to mixed mode. The main difference here, Windows 2000 domain controllers are not supported, and this is not meant to be a long-term solution. This is something that you just basically set up, and it's used to basically migrate your NT4 domain controllers up to Server 2003. Then, of course, we have our highest functional level, and that's Server 2003. And as we've been talking about all along, this will only support Server 2003 domain controllers. And once you upgrade to this level, all the features in Windows 2003 are now going to be available to you at the domain level, though, at the domain level. If we want all the features in 2003, we're going to have to worry about our forest functional level. Okay? Even if you only have one domain in your forest, you're still going to have to upgrade this forest functional level. Now, Windows 2000. The default level is Windows 2000 Forest functional level, and this is going to support NT4 2000 and 2003 domain controllers. All of these are supported. Most of our new Active Directory features in 2003 are disabled, so they're just not available. Windows Server 2003 interim mode, just like we saw before, this is a special Forest functional level that's used to migrate NT4 domain controllers up to 2003. And then finally, we have our Server 2003 Forest functional level, and this is then used if we want to have support for all the new features that we have, everything, in Server 2003. Okay? To do this, all the domain controllers in the entire forest. Everything must be at Windows 2000 native mode or higher. Okay, and then raising the forest functional level will raise all the domains to Server 2003 domain functional level. Now this is kind of confusing. When I first read these two statements, they seem to be kind of almost contradicting each other. This statement says all domain controllers in the domain must be at Windows 2000 native mode or higher. And I found that to be kind of strange. I would think that everybody would have to be at Server 2003. Then the next statement here says raising the forest functional level up to Server 2003 raises all domains to Server 2003 domain functional level. Okay, and this is actually what happens, this second statement. Just bear in mind that this is the prerequisite. If you're in Windows 2000 mixed mode, okay, you don't even have this option available to you. You can't upgrade to Server 2003 forest functional level until you've upgraded your domain to Windows 2000 native mode. Okay, so that's all that it's stating here. If you're in one of these modes here and you upgrade to Server 2003 Forest functional level, this is automatically going to bring you up, bring all your domains up to Server 2003 functional level as well. Now, what are some of the features that we benefit from? Well, we have a lot of features in Windows 2000 native mode, so those are important. But in addition, domain controller renaming, and also reorganizing. We can actually move domain controllers around. Improved, actually I take that back, the domain reorganization, you can move the location of the domains around. So if you wanted a particular domain to be relocated on a different side of the forest, that's what you'd be doing in that case. It's not to move domain controllers around. Improved Active Directory replication, it's more secure, more efficient, and also improved global catalog replication. And it's the same thing, it's more efficient and more secure. So this is something that's important. I wouldn't stress out about it right away, but it's something at some point, once your domain controllers all are running in 2003, then you definitely want to upgrade to Forest functional level of Server 2003, but it's not going to kill you if you're not up there right away. Let's take a look at how we do this. And we're going to connect over using a remote desktop connection again. Okay, and one of these is already done for us. I believe we upgraded our domain already. Okay, and if we take a look here, raise domain functional level. We're currently at Windows Server 2003 domain functional level. Okay, and it tells us that this domain's operating at the highest possible functional level. So there's nothing we can do with this. This is where it's set though, so we do it right here within Active Directory users and computers. If we go to Active Directory domains and trusts, this is where we can actually raise the forest functional level. Oops. Here we have, this is the domain functional level again. Forest functional level is done here on this top piece. Raise forest functional level. And currently right now we're in Windows 2000 forest functional level. So if we want to do this, we can do this right now and we'll go ahead and do it. Let's raise this forest up to Server 2003 forest functional level. So just by clicking raise and clicking OK, tells us right here it was done successfully. That's simple. Okay, if we come back in here again, it should show us we're now at the highest forest functional level that there is. Okay, so it's a pretty straightforward process. The only thing I caution you of before you just rush out and start upgrading your servers to the highest forest functional level, make sure that there are no needs to support Windows 2000 domain controllers in your environment. NT 4.0 is probably not much of a concern at this point, but definitely make sure that you don't have Windows 2000 domain controllers because they will cease to exist as far as your Server 2003 domain controllers are concerned. Okay, that wraps up then our video on our important terms. We'll see you back here real soon when we get started on the labs. We'll get into the meat and the potatoes of this particular course, and you get a real good feel of how Active Directory works in Server 2003.